Good morning. Today is the 13th of Iyar and the 4th of May, and we're holding by the 5th reading of Emor, which today is actually pretty short. It's just a few verses, and we're starting in Leviticus chapter 22, verse 23. There's a lot of interesting things about the next two verses. We're not going to be able to go over all of them. We'll just go over one idea. God said to Moses to say, "Speak to the children of Israel, saying to them, you must celebrate the first day of the 7th month. 7th month is, of course, Tishrei, because we start counting the months from Nisan, whereas the new year begins, the year begins with Tishrei. So the months, we have 2 new years. We actually have 4. But when it comes to the years, we have 2 new years. The first one is the 1st of Nisan. That's the first of the months, and that we talked a little bit about yesterday. And we also have the 1st of Tishrei, which is the first day of the year. So the first day of the lunar calendar and the first day of the solar calendar, if you want. But it's not really divided that way. It's just called 2 new years. The difference in general between them is that on Nisan everything is renewed, whereas on Tishrei, everything is strengthened. 2 different concepts. One of renewal on Nisan, like now, the spring and the renewal of nature. And in Tishrei, the strengthening of what there already is. That on Nisan, because when Tishrei comes around, it's after Elul, it's after the reckoning that people do during Elul, and we fix what we already have. Whereas on Nisan, it's like beginning something entirely new. In any case, let's continue. So what happens on the first day of the 7th month? You shall have a day of rest, a remembrance of the Shofar blast, a holy day, or a day of holy reading. What does it mean that it's a day of the remembrance of the Shofar blast? So if I would just ask somebody, they would say that you remember the shofar blast, meaning that you don't blow the shofar. If you only remember the shofar blast, why would you actually blow it? It's just to remember the shofar blast. And the natural question that would rise would be, and which shofar blast are we supposed to remember? In any case, it's not read that way, even though that's the literal meaning. The way that it's understood is that there are years in which we blow the shofar on the first day of Tishrei, meaning on Rosh Hashanah, and they are years we don't. What's the difference between this year and a Saturday? It's a Shabbos. Then we only remember the shofar blast. We don't actually blow the shofar. And on regular years, when the first day of Tishrei is on a weekday, we do blow the shofar. But you still can't get away from the fact that this is called a day of remembrance of the shofar blast. So the way that the sages understood this, to put everything together, was shofar blast, except that in some years we remember the shofar blast because we don't blow it. So what does it mean that Rosh Hashanah is the day of remembrance? That's what comes out of all of this. Rosh Hashanah is called also Yom HaZikaron. That's actually the bracha that we make on the candles. When we light candles on Rosh Hashanah Eve, the bracha that we say is Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech HaOlam, Asher Kitshanu Mitzotav V'tzivanu Adlik Ner Shel Yom HaZikaron, to light the candle of the day of remembrance. So what is this remembrance? What's going on? So the remembrance, the sages say, is actually twofold. On the one hand, we are remembering God in a certain sense. What are we remembering? That He created the world, because this is the first day of man's existence in the world. This is what we call the 6th day of creation. So we remember, this is a day of remembering the creation of the world. But it also goes in the other direction. Not only are we remembering God, and by doing so we are also crowning Him as the King of the world, but He also remembers us. And actually, in the prayers that we say on Rosh Hashanah, in all the prayers that we mention, 10 verses of remembrance, they are more about God remembering us than we remembering Him. And this is a very important point. What does it mean that God remembers someone? as if God doesn't know that I'm here. He knows that I'm here. To remember, it's very interesting, is here we have to add what the Arizal taught. In the scroll of Esther, there's a very interesting verse. It says there, "Vayamim ha'ele nizkarim v'na'asim." These days are remembered and, one would say, observed every year. Because we remember the days of Purim and we observe them every year. One of the most important examples of how can you get an entire people to keep the same day, even though they were dispersed over the entire world already. But it was such an incredible event, what happened in Persia in that story, that the entire Jewish people accepted it. So these days are remembered and observed. The Arizal, Rabbi Isaac Luria, he says, because they are remembered, that is why they are observed, or why they are done. To be observed, in English it's a very interesting choice. I observe the commandments. What do you mean I observe? I look at them? What's the point? Why are you saying you look at them? But here it's very interesting that this translation is a very good translation of what happens in Hebrew. That because these days are remembered, they are performed, or they are done, in the sense that when you remember something, especially when God remembers something, then it's a process of creation. Creation is a process of remembrance. It's not something that's always so easy to understand. But again, you have to put it together with what it says in the scroll of Esther. When it's remembered, it is done, it is performed. Every type of action, every type of performance, asiyah, in the Torah means, say the Kabbalists, it means an enclosement. It means that I'm taking one thing and I'm putting it into something else. I'm giving it form. I'm taking the form and putting it into some matter. I'm informing it. I'm making it into something whole. The example by man is that the soul enters the body. When the soul enters the body, it gives the body its form. It informs it. It makes it. So this remembrance, says the Arizal, and this is the way that the Baal Shem Tov also explained this, is a day on which God remembers us, not just in order to, as if He forgot, He didn't remember everyone, but rather it's a day on which our souls are strengthened. The remembrance itself causes the soul to be strengthened. Now this goes back to the issue of why is it that on Shabbat, when Rosh Hashanah comes out on Shabbat, we don't blow the shofar. The reason is simply because on Shabbat we don't need to. There's no need for it. Because every Shabbat what happens is that the soul is strengthened in the body. What does it mean that the soul is strengthened in the body? We see that people who are, some people reported that there were people who, when they came out of the mikveh on Friday before Shabbat, they had to change to different clothing than they wore during the rest of the week, because physically they became bigger. There are such reports. I don't know what to do with them, but it's said about various tzaddikim. But every person merits to receive what we call neshama yetera, receives an extra portion of his soul on Shabbat. He has more spiritual power on Shabbat than he does during the rest of the weekdays. It's a spiritual potential that he receives. It's not necessarily to be physically more fit or physically stronger, even though when you consider how much we eat on Shabbat, it's probably at some level we all have some kind of miracle that we can actually survive after those copious amounts of food. And that's why usually the stomach hurts when Motzei Shabbat, when the neshama yetera leaves, when the additional soul leaves. But really the meaning is that we have additional potential with the shofar. Rather, the Shabbat itself is already a coronation of God, and therefore there was no need to add another act such as blowing the shofar. And we go back to something that's actually higher, and this is a very important principle. When Rosh Hashanah is on Shabbat, even though we don't blow the shofar, but we read the same verses, the same 30 verses of the 30 sounds of the shofar. And it is well known, and we talked about this actually a few weeks ago when we were talking about sacrifices, that when we read something, it actually has a greater effect sometimes than the act itself. The same is true here. Let me just finish with one small gematria. Nizkarim v'nasim. These days are remembered, and therefore they are performed or observed. The two words are nizkar v'naasa. Nizkar means to remember, it was remembered. Naasa means it is performed or it is done. The value of these two words together, nizkar, remembered, and naasa, done, is equal to Shabbat, as a very nice allusion to the fact that on Shabbat, the very remembrance already causes the action to take place. The very remembrance of the shofar blast is already as if the shofar was blasted, as if it did already happen, and therefore we don't blow the shofar when it comes out on Shabbat. There's a whole discussion in the Talmud for technical reasons why we don't do it, but what we just explained are some of the spiritual reasons that have to do with the lack of the remembrance of the shofar blast on the day of remembrance. Every Rosh Hashanah, Hashem remembers all the creatures of the world. In other words, when He remembers them, He gives them more strength to endure through the next year. Very nice, and to see everyone, and hope to see you tomorrow.
Thank you, Rabbi. Have a good day.